Hello, everyone. This is Gabagai. uh, in kind of assessing and evaluating what I have to offer as far as my channel and who I am, um, I realize that there are a lot of really good channels with really good content on YouTube, and my channel, I don't have the know-how or the time to put together material that has a lot of bells and whistles, and I also just don't have the skills. I lack the kind of video editing skills and things. So pretty much everything that I put out there is just what I record. If I like it and it's at least halfway acceptable, I keep it, and if not, I just go ahead and delete it. And a lot of what I do is just hangouts and things like that. Um, but I think I do have something to offer by way of just my own personal experiences, my my past as a evangelical Christian who has deconverted from Christianity, and and just kind of I think I can be less abrasive than some of my counterparts on YouTube. And so, in particular, I would like to this year kind of expand on some of the things that I've put out there already, but go into maybe some more details and things related to problems in the Bible. And so, this particular video really relates to problems in the Bible, um, as I'm in conversations with Christians, particularly Christians who have not encountered uh, kind of atheist counter arguments and things, or skeptical counter arguments to their religious faith. When I even bring up the idea of problems in the Bible, a lot of times I'm just met with shock, and I think the reason for that is that people uh, communicate and socialize with people who tend to agree with them, and I'm generalizing, and I know there are a lot of Christians who engage in discussions with non-believing friends and family members and so forth, but I think there are huge portions of the population that listen to Christian radio, to Christian, other media sources and things. They go to church and associate with friends and family who are Christians and believers. Some of them work in Christian places, and those who don't, usually religion is pretty much off the table for kind of workplace discussions, and I think rightfully so for the most part. I mean, if people want to, whatever, that's another topic altogether. But um, the main idea that is you if you're in this homogenous group and you're not exposed to at least the problems that are identified by people who disagree with your position, one, you're not very well armed, quote, to use their kind of metaphor, to defend your faith, and and you're also vulnerable. So, um, and I think there are a lot of channels that deal with these issues, but they deal with it in a way that is very cutting and edgy, and while thorough and also to the point, can be offensive. And I think a lot of believers may write write that off, when they see this kind of confrontational, or coarse and sometimes vulgar, uh, you know, uh, what's the word? Um, kind of handling of the Bible. They're able to dismiss it in a way that a more sober and less vulgar uh, kind of treatment of the same concepts and ideas might find an audience that's that's more willing to at least consider the possibilities that there really are some serious problems with the text itself and with the messages contained in the Bible. So this particular video deals with slavery in the Bible, and what I did, I really did a Bible study on the issue of slavery, and I, searched the Bible, searched verses on the internet and things, and I searched counter apologetics to an apologetic. Uh, Reasons and argumentation related to the issue of slavery, and so this little PowerPoint presentation is what I put together. Um, and for those of you who don't know, I'm Gava Guy, and you can look at my channel to see more about who I am and what I'm about. So looking at Old Testament slavery laws, the first thing that I kind of was aware of was just the lack of any kind of systematic approach to creating rules and laws for the people to be governed by. The kind of the books of law are Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Those books have laws and rules that aren't really categorized, so to speak, and they're just not thorough. They also don't define things well, and we'll talk more about that later. There's no issue that is handled exhaustively, like, how to handle children of slaves. There are things about these issues, but they don't spell out in detail how this should be handled. There's no slaves' rights. There's no appeals process. It's really just a patchwork of laws that leave much room for interpretation, which may be the intent. They had, before the kings of Israel, and I think even after the king system was put in place, they had judges who were appointed to kind of handle legal questions and issues and problems. But if you're familiar at all with the Book of Judges and Ruth and even Samuel, you'll know that the judges were not, not always concerned with what is truly just and things. So there were complaints, which is why they ended up with kings. But anyhow, and so this presentation is my attempt at consolidating that information and grouping it in sections by subject. So how you could become a slave according to the Old Testament. There were a number of different ways. One, and this is kind of probably the favorite of apologists to point to, and that's a Hebrew citizen, Israelite citizen, could sell him or herself into slavery as an escape from starvation. So instead of a social security system, they would say, well, I can sell myself into slavery. And we see that in the verse Leviticus 25, verse 39. If any one of your fellow Israelites falls into poverty and is forced to sell himself to you, do not treat him as a slave. So they are slaves, but they're, at least in this verse, slave masters are told, well, if it's your fellow Israelite, don't treat them as a slave, whatever that means. The second way is that you could purchase slaves from foreigners. So you can go out and buy a slave. This verse, Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, is very famous. Anybody who has dealt with atheists is familiar with this verse. You may purchase male and female slaves from among the nations around you. You may also purchase the children of temporary residents who live among you, including those who have been born in your land. You may treat them as your property, passing them on to your children as permanent inheritance. You may treat them as slaves, but you must never treat your own fellow Israelites this way. So if you purchase foreigners, you can treat them as slaves, whatever that means. Binding them, I suppose, beating them and whipping them. I don't know. Captives taken in war was another way that you could become a slave in the Old Testament, under Old Testament law. We see this in Deuteronomy 20, verses 10 through 14. As you approach a town to attack it, you must first offer its people terms of peace. If they accept your terms and open the gates to you, then all the people inside will serve you in forced labor. But if they refuse to make peace and prepare for flight, you must attack the town, and you must kill every man in the town. You may keep for yourselves the women and children, livestock, and other plunder. You may enjoy the plunder from your enemies that the Lord your God has given you. So here we see you can be captured in battle and become a slave. Women could be captured and even forced to marry their slave masters, or at that point, I guess, their husbands. And there are a number of verses dealing with war captures, captives, and slavery. Finally, you can sell your daughters, and this was, an alternative. I would guess that this maybe happens before you become a slave yourself. In Exodus 21, verse 7, when a man sells his daughter as a slave. And male children were not to be sold. There are verses that talk about this. I guess if the whole family gets sold as slaves or something, then that might be a different issue. I don't know, but there are different laws related to male and female children and male and female slaves, and the different protections for male slaves versus female slaves and things. And this brings up another issue that I will also be hopefully be able to deal with, is just the disparity between protections under Old Testament law for men and women. So there are a number of ways that slaves could be freed, and this again is another kind of portion of the law that apologists like to push or point to say, oh, Old Testament slavery was okay. The year of Jubilee, every 7 years, the slaves would be freed, but this was only males. According to Exodus 21, verse 7, according to Deuteronomy 15:12, it sounds like both male and female, so there's confusion there and conflicting information. Slaves could be freed through marriage to a free citizen, or if you were a slave and you were married and your husband rejects you, then you're free. If your master mistreats you and breaks your tooth or blinds you, Exodus 21, 26, and 27 say that the slave is freed. That's the price of his freedom, essentially, which doesn't sound great, but it's some level of protection, I suppose, for the slave. But if he's poor and he's sold himself into slavery to just pay the bills and survive, now he's lame and less able to work than he was before, and I can't imagine that he'd be better off being freed from slavery. But so freedom purchased by relatives. So, and this is for males only. It sounds like, according to the verses, if you look at it in Leviticus 25, verses 47 through 52. And I know I'm kind of going through these fast, but there's just so much scripture that relates to this. I'm giving these references, and you can pause the video and stop at any time, look up the references, see what it says for yourself. But I took a lot of time looking up these things and taking very careful and extensive notes on them. So finally, if you escape as a runaway, according to Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, the people you run to, it indicates in another town. If you come across a slave who has escaped, you're not supposed to return them to their master. Apparently, um, this is if the slavery is so bad. Um, I don't know, if the slaves were kept shackled and things. My guess is if there was a potential for running away, or that was a constant problem, my guess is that it would be a practice that they would, um, start to implement, because you don't want your slaves to run away. And most slaves, I don't think, want to be slaves. So if they knew that they could just run away and escape, um, that's likely what they would do. I mean, there's no way to know for sure, but I mean that's typical of slaves, that you are in bondage and in chains. Um, so I don't know how often that you had actual runaways, successful runaway slaves. And it also says that if you're in another town and the slaves from that other, some distant town or something, that you're not to return them. If you're in the same town, there's some ambiguity there. And what we'll also see coming up later, that the the idea of returning a runaway slave is not always apparently a bad thing, as noted by Paul in his letter to Philemon. So, what protections were there in the Old Testament for slaves? There's lots of talk about not treating Hebrew slaves harshly, or it says in some places, don't treat them as slaves. Um, the degree to which harsh treatment is not allowed is not real clear, but in Exodus 21, it does say that you can beat your slaves because they are your property. But a slave owner who beats his slave so badly that the slave can't get up in 2 days uh, should be punished. If it's 2 or 3 days and the slave hasn't been able to stand up, uh, then the slave owner should be punished in some way. It doesn't specify. Um, apparently, the laws that apply to regular free citizens regarding beatings and things like that, and an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, don't apply to the slaves. Although if they lose an eye or a tooth, uh, they're done. Broken bones, I don't know. But there's just a whole lot that's just not lined out in this Old Testament law, and it's left up to the judges, who were often very corrupt. The runaway escape clause, that's you can get free, so that's kind of a protection, I suppose, provided that you actually can break free from your bonds or chains or what have you. Slaves were not supposed to be beaten to death, again from Exodus 21, but but the punishment was not the same. As I said, they if a free citizen beat another citizen to death, he would lose his life. The death penalty was enforced. That was not the case for slaves. A killed slave was to be, or the slave master was to be punished, but it doesn't say how severely. And it's interesting, if you read Exodus 21, it lists all of these kind of crimes and punishment, and just kind of randomly listing them out. If you disrespect your parents, it's the death penalty. If you kill someone else, it's the death penalty. But if you kill a slave, you get punished. So it's very clear that this is not the death penalty, because otherwise they would have, come right out and said it, as they did for disrespecting your parents, which seems like a much less, severe crime, and you're going to still inflict the death penalty there. But for the other one, you'll say you should be punished. It's rather upside down. Um, Maiming, disfigurement, and things like that was not prohibited. So there is nothing in there about chopping off a hand, chopping off a foot. And I've heard apologists say, well, that's against the interest of the slave owners. Well, not necessarily. And we saw this in the American South, that kind of severe punishment, burning, you know, just torturing essentially, was often used as a deterrent for other slaves to conform and obey. And if that helps your situation and nobody's stopping you from doing it, then um, it doesn't seem like it's prohibited if you read the Old Testament. Um, and now you could say, well, that might fall under harsh treatment. Well, that's only for one set of people. For foreign slaves, it seems like you can do just about anything. And it's not clear if the Exodus 21 passage only covers the Israelite slaves or if that covers foreign slaves. There just isn't. It's not well written. The idea behind law is to put clear restrictions on things, and when the laws are left with a lot of question marks, it becomes a problem, especially when you have appointed judges that have no accountability and it's just no qualifications necessarily. It leads to problems, and the Bible is clear that was a problem in the Old Testament Hebrew culture. Other problems. Slaves had no protection from sexual advances. So slave masters, there was no prohibition. It was apparently common practice in that culture that you could take a slave into your bed. Even the Hebrew founding fathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, had slaves, and Abraham and I believe Isaac both slept with their servant girls. And it was not something that was frowned on by Yahweh. Now, Abraham got in trouble for it, but only because Yahweh apparently wanted his child to come from Sarah. But it wasn't the act itself that was bad; it was the situation. And we would call this statutory rape. So it's just not. It's clearly not a good institution from that perspective, and it's not the poor slave girls. Good heavens. Another huge issue and a big gap in this Old Testament law is even for the protections that it says, the slave masters shouldn't do this and that. Slaves should be allowed to do X, Y, and Z or whatever. There's not a whole lot of that. There's not any, Bill of Rights for slaves in the Old Testament. But there's no teeth, really. There's no appeals system, or at least it's not detailed there. And you could make something up and say, well, it would have had to exist, but you have no reason to believe that. You're adding things to the text if you're going to go that route. We could say, well, people didn't beat their slaves either, just because it's in the law. Well, you don't write laws for things that aren't happening. So anyhow, who reports or calls cruel slave masters to account? That's not clear. There's no there's no appointed um, task. What do they call it? Kind of a watchdog group or anything like that, to advocate for the rights of slaves, or to make sure that even the very thin protections that are there are enforced. Um, and I've mentioned this a number of times: the ambiguity and poorly defined terms. Judges were prone to inconsistency and corruption. No legal mechanism for slave appeals. Um, and no enforcement agency or anything like that. Um, and then the consistent privilege of males over females, really everywhere in the Old Testament. Um, Severely beaten slaves, and if a slave can get up within a 48-hour window, there's no punishment at all for the master. It's also it's not clear, what happens if the slave can't get up. It does say that if the slave dies, but what if he dies on the third day? What if he gets up one day and then maybe has internal bleeding and things? We know these kinds of things can happen, that someone can maybe have a head injury or something like that, and they can get up and be walking around and then collapse sometime later because of aneurysm in the brain or something like that. So, I mean, there are all these problems and potential situations that are not addressed in the law, and would be left up to maybe even a corrupt judge. Maybe the slave master is buddies with him, and maybe he's paying him on the side. And if you don't think that those things were happening back then, I think you're not being honestly reading the text, because it clearly says that these things were going on. If you read, First Samuel and Book of Judges and things, these people were not the upright citizens brigade here. They were as human as any person in power has ever been. Runaway slave protections were disregarded by Paul in the book of Philemon. Philemon contradicts Deuteronomy 23:15. And so we have this break from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. It almost seems to suggest that in the New Covenant, it's overturning the ban on returning runaway slaves to their masters, that was found in Deuteronomy there. So, what is Paul's purpose here? I don't know exactly. He does not say to Philemon that Philemon should free Onesimus. He just says when he returns to you, don't beat him. Future beatings are not taken off the table. Freedom is not suggested or hinted at. He just says, he's your brother in Christ now. Please, receive him and be kind. But slaves are still slaves. And that brings me to the biggest problem at all. Slavery at its core is a corrupt institution. You can't choose what you want to do with your life. You get up in the morning when your slave master tells you to get up. You do what your slave master tells you to do. And if not, your slave master can beat you. The slaves could be sold, so family members could be sold off. And there's no prohibition against that. Slaves, if you have children, and your slaves can, your children's slaves can be sold, or even in the year of Jubilee, families can be split up because the parents can go free, but any slaves that were born while they were slaves under that slave master can be kept by the slave master. And there's also kind of a loophole clause that if a slave If a man becomes a slave, a Hebrew becomes a slave, and the slave master gives him a wife while he's a slave, uh, then when the year of Jubilee comes, he's got two choices. One, he can leave his wife and child and be free, but the wife and child, or if he has any children, the rest of his family remains slaves forever, because the women are not kept, and slaves, children that are born under slavery are slaves for life. Um, and uh, and if if he wants to stay and chooses to stay rather than to be freed in the year of Jubilee, then he uh, he becomes a slave for life. He has to go before the elders of the community and pledge his love to the slave master, and then he becomes a slave for life, even if he's a Hebrew male slave. So this is a loophole that's found, I believe it's in the book of Exodus, and I could shoot myself for not including that as one of the problems here. But anyhow, moving on, and slaves don't have equal rights with free people, as we've seen. If a slave is killed, the master is punished. If a slave loses an eye or a tooth, the master doesn't lose an eye or a tooth. The slave goes free. But so clearly, the level of protection for slaves is not there like it is for free citizens. So, and if slavery was okay for the Hebrews, would we consider it morally acceptable today? Obviously, we don't. So we need to consider these things, and so this really is intended not so much for the atheists who are going to be you rah rah or anything, but for Christians to consider these things. If you are truly interested in whether or not your book is a moral guide, if your book had divine inspiration, these are serious problems for you to consider. Why would an all just God give his chosen people laws that include permissions to enslave people? So here are some of the rationalizations that I've found from some of the kind of top apologetics websites regarding slavery. So from Carm, they say, well, slavery was permitted in the Bible because of the sin of the world. And so, sure, slavery is bad, but if it's true that it was kind of a tolerance rather than a nod, an approval, why wasn't it ever condemned? Carm gives the example of divorce, and this is kind of a common thing that they say, well, this exists. Well, because it's just tolerated. He deals with the people the way that they are. But divorce is pointed out as something that was like that. God hates divorce, is what's said in the New Testament. There's no verse that says God hates slavery. There's no verse that says slavery in an ideal world would not exist. If you have the choice of having slaves or not having slaves, don't do it. There's nothing that says God detests slavery. But we know that it's a terrible institution, and it's rife with abuses and violations of human rights all over the place, because the person that is the slave is owned like property, and the slave master basically has free reign to do what he wants with that person. So I went to godandscience.org, which was another website that addressed this issue. Their quote was, "The Bible does not say God supports slavery. In fact, the slavery described in the Old Testament was different from the kind of slavery we think of today, in which people are captured and sold as slaves. According to Old Testament law, anyone caught selling another person into slavery would be executed." So there's two issues here. One is the Bible doesn't say God supports slavery. Well, I mean, the Bible doesn't say God supports, um, rape. There's some dealings with rape in the Bible, uh, or that was probably a bad example. But I mean, owning a person as property and keeping them bound, chained as slaves, uh, they can be beaten. Kidnapping is clearly said to be a bad thing, um, but beating and chaining people up is not bad. I mean, why does kidnapping make it bad? So my suggestion here is that if we accept the biblical model of slavery, would it be acceptable today? Was so, for example, Abraham Lincoln outlawed slavery in the United States. Should he have just said, "Well, as long as you don't kidnap the slaves, then it's okay. You can buy them from a foreign land, but don't kidnap them." Um, because what was happening in the U.S. was people were buying it from a foreign land. They were captured in the foreign land. The Bible says that they are able to buy slaves from other lands or the lands around them, and there's no system in place, as far as the Bible says, to make sure that those people weren't captured or kidnapped in the foreign land. Um, so I don't know why this just seems very petty and nitpicky and irrelevant to the main point that slavery as an institution is corrupt and problematic. Um, and I mean, the other side of this is that think of all of the little silly things that are included, the detail that's included in the Old Testament law about not eating shellfish and not eating, animals with a cloven hoof or something. I mean, just ridiculous stuff that Yahweh was concerned with, and women taking, cleaning themselves so many times or in such a way when they've had their period, not wearing clothing of, mixed fabrics, but slavery is not included as something that, was important enough for the Bible to say, hey, this is a problem. So comparing the Hebrew laws with the U.S. laws, I mean, you can beat slaves because they're your property. In Hebrew slavery in the U.S., pre-Civil War laws, you could beat them. Legal rights and protections were less for slaves than for free people. True in both cases. Sex with slaves in Hebrew was okay, but in the U.S. it was taboo and shameful. But we know what went on all the time. Kidnapping of countrymen for sale as slaves was banned. Kidnapping of white people, countrymen, and use of slaves was not okay in the U.S. No killing slaves unless they die after a few days. It's okay to kill slaves if they were bad in the U.S. So, I mean, they both have things that were terrible. They both had things that were maybe a little better than the other side. But all told, it's still slavery. People are still being captured, trapped in a lifestyle where they have no real rights and no way to defend themselves against brutality, against just harsh work conditions and things like that. Just not good. So one last website that I went to was christiananswers.net. This is a quote from them. The page was essentially a conversation between a Christian apologist and a skeptic. But I don't think that it was uh, a real skeptic. They kind of crafted the objections themselves, which you can kind of make the person say whatever you want. But basically, the summary at the end was that the Bible primarily details the account of how God has chosen to deal with the tragic results of sin-fallen worlds. So this again goes back to, well, it's a bad world, and he's giving laws to kind of make the best of it, meeting the people where they live, essentially. We recognize the reality of slavery. The Bible never condones it again. We get the same kind of thing. Both then and more recently, a spiritual basis for worth, dignity, equality, and hope to face difficult circumstances. In the end, at a deeper level, the Bible's position is clear. But that's not true. If it was, if it was clear, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. It's always easy to drive a fake conversation with a skeptic. This is the first thing. You can make the person say whatever you want. It's kind of like Tommy Hall's little demonstrations with the puppets that he uses. It's he does it somewhat for entertainment, but he's also kind of trying to make a point. But you can do whatever you want with puppets, and when you are making your opponent's mouth move, it's not quite the same thing. The plain truth is that Yahweh thought it was more important to tell his people not to eat shrimp and not to wear clothing made from mixed fabrics, but slavery was okay. I mean, that's the bottom line. So another issue is if this portion of the law was wrong but was allowed because of sin in the world. One, why didn't Yahweh make it clear that this institution was corrupt, like he does with divorce? As I said earlier, in the New Testament, Jesus says, well, God hates divorce. Yahweh hates divorce. But he allowed it because their hearts were hard. There's nothing about slavery that is equivalent to that. Jesus tells the people to obey masters, or slaves, obey your masters. So he's talking about the issue of slavery. If he had slipped in and masters, you should free your slaves, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And that, if there was anything like that in the Bible, but it's not there. It's just not there. And if this is true, also, what about other portions of the law? For example, homosexuality. If we can say, in the end, it's clear that we have a spiritual basis for worth, dignity, and equality. None of those things are really outlined as such in the Bible. Those are all kind of Enlightenment ideals. And then they, in some cases will point to Jesus saying, or was it Jesus or Paul? I forget, who said, there's no slave, no man, no woman in Christ, or whatever. I think that's Paul. But, that ideal, for one, it wasn't outlined by Jesus. That was an invention of Paul's. And two, it doesn't give us legal basis for that or anything like that. So these things are there. The institution of slavery is there, and it's never dealt with in a negative way in the Bible. So, in summary, the issue of slavery is a major problem for anyone who claims that the Bible is the moral guide for humanity. That's a huge problem. Christian apologists, they try and whitewash the practice from the Old Testament, but slavery is slavery, and nice slavery is still slavery. Even if it was nicer than it was in the U.S., but even then, I find that kind of hard to believe that would be the case. It's a black eye on the Old Testament law, and the question that I try to press when in conversations with believers: would you be willing to implement these same laws in your country today? If the Old Testament laws were divinely inspired, if they were the perfect law given by an all-just deity, do you think that slavery should be included in our laws? And if not, I suggest to you that slavery is not good, and that the Old Testament was written by people, and there was no deity involved with it at all. And again, the purpose of this discussion in this video is not to say the Old Testament is flawed, slavery is bad, therefore there's no God. That's not what I'm getting at. The point of this is merely that the Old Testament was written by people, and there's no reason to believe that there was a deity involved with it. It has problems and is flawed, and is certainly not infallible or inerrant. And so this was the first installment. There will be more to come. Thank you for watching. Part 2 will be coming in the next month or two, hopefully. I'm working on it. So thanks for watching. Like and share if you enjoyed this. And if you have ideas, or you have a different argument than the ones that were presented here to explain why you think that the Old Testament slavery laws were in fact good, then I'm all ears. I'm willing to have discussions and dialogue with believers who want to defend their faith, and I'm willing to have my mind changed. My mind was changed from being a believer to not being a believer, and I'm willing to change back. I am not. I did so because I found the ideas and things contained in Christianity no longer palatable or true or good. So if you could convince me otherwise, yeah, I'll be more than happy. It'd be convenient for me with regard to family and friends who are still believers. I've lost this kind of commonality between those circles. And I would be more than happy to gain that commonality back if I thought that there was credibility to these things. So hope you enjoyed that, and like I said, pass that along. And again, I'm hopeful that this kind of series will deal with these issues in a way that is more palatable to believers, to people who might be turned off by language, or kind of crude or vulgar things in Dark Matter 2525. I love his videos. I think he's brilliant, but I think he can be, him and others. Non-stamp collector also does a great job. And there are a lot of good atheist videos out there that deal with these things, but people who genuinely believe may just look at those things and dismiss it and say, well, they don't understand, and they're just wanting to be wicked terrible people and things. And that's not me at all. And I don't think that that's true of them either. But I'm interested in persuading people and uh, changing lives, so to speak, for the better. So anyhow, again, thanks for watching. That's all I've got.